They did it! They really actually did it! SpaceX pulled off both pre-flight static fires with Ship 37, meaning that we've progressed that much closer to Starship Flight 10. But that's not all. Ship 38, slated for Flight 11, also made a big leap forward this week. And we finally got to see some progress on the very first Block 3 ship as well. Howdy, Tank Watchers! I'm Jack Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update. Before we dive deep into all the ship action of the week, let's check in with some ongoing items in Starbase. Over at the Massey Outpost, the remains of old Booster 13 are still sitting near the entrance. SpaceX is likely taking an extended look at this hardware and documenting anything they need to document before inevitably scrapping it. At the launch site, we are seeing some groundwork at the former main entrance. Sadly, we're currently lacking any documentation or concrete evidence of what this area might become. It could be anything from related tank farm infrastructure to possibly a new break room for the launch site crew, or it's maybe a block room similar to what we see at quite a few of the launch sites over at the Cape. Anything is possible, and we'll just have to wait and see what this shapes up to be in the end. Over at the tank farm, we've been seeing a steady stream of commodity deliveries. Methane, liquid oxygen, and nitrogen all coming in regularly. With a vast amount of testing on the horizon and a flight getting ever closer, this makes perfect sense. SpaceX will want to keep the tank farm topped off to avoid any supply issues during the upcoming testing and flight campaign. Let's dive into our McGregor Minute for this week, the segment where we check in on all the Starship-related activity happening at SpaceX's McGregor engine test facility. One big milestone this week was the very first firing on the brand new Raptor North test stand. This stand officially came online on July 30th, and based on what we've seen, is most likely dedicated for Raptor 3 engine testing. After all, at this point, why would SpaceX still be building new Raptor 2 test stands? Raptor North is one of two new test stands meant to expand engine testing capability, the other being located in the Raptor South test stand area. This initial test lasted just 2 seconds. You wouldn't want to risk anything on its first test firing, would you? It was likely meant to qualify and verify the new test stand before moving on to longer duration runs. Speaking of Raptor 3, we spotted 2 of them rolling past our cameras this week. One had a clearly visible serial number, 24, while the other was harder to read, but appeared to be a 3X engine, likely somewhere in the 30s. After spotting Raptor 31 a few weeks ago, this is the second engine that is spotted that's somewhere in the 30s. Of course, they'll need many more for Starship Block 3, since not all of these engines will make it onto vehicles. Some will be destroyed during testing. But it's clear that they're finding their rhythm with production cadence. As always, for this and much more, make sure to check out our McGregor Live 24/7 live stream. Over at Pad 2, the work, of course, never stops. Earlier in the week, we spotted more sections of the flame trench wall being lifted into place. These pieces bring the tops of the walls level with the top of the launch mount and are part of the final outfitting that SpaceX is carrying out to get the trench ready for operations. At the same time, an army of equipment and workers is still hard at work on the service structure, installing the systems it needs to function. Sections of cladding for this structure have been seen turning up in Starbase, indicating that maybe work here could be getting close to wrapping up. Bit by bit, SpaceX is edging closer to having the pad ready for operations, a key step toward bringing this Block 3 ready second Starship pad at Starbase online. A bit later, another one of these wall sections was lifted into place. It appears these are being installed closer to the west side of the pad, the side facing the production site. Now, we'll spare you from mentioning every single wall section that was installed from here on out, but we can tell you that on Tuesday, the same kind of work continued as they kept outfitting the flame trench. While we'll be focusing on Ship 37, the star of the next flight, a little later in the video, it's also important to check in on Ship 38. This is, of course, the vehicle slated for Starship's 11th flight, which will likely take place sometime in the September launch window. At the start of the week, Ship 38 was moved to the Massey Outpost and was then prepped for cryogenic proof testing. During these tests, SpaceX fills the ship liquid oxygen tank with liquid oxygen and the methane tank with nitrogen to ensure they're capable of being able to hold up against operational pressures. Interestingly, Ship 38's payload bay door remained open throughout the day with teams visibly working on it. Just to give you an understanding of how long it remained open, the payload bay door was still open on Tuesday, 24 hours later. And that is fairly unusual to see for these kinds of doors, open for this long of a duration. So it seems like SpaceX really needed to access that area of the ship for a long period of time. But wait, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I said that Ship 38 went to Massey's for cryo, and I didn't tell you how it went, so let's back up a bit. On Wednesday, SpaceX had plans for Ship 38, putting it through a fairly involved testing sequence that lasted several hours. The first step appeared to be a full load of both the methane and liquid oxygen tanks, as well as the header tanks, judging by the frost all the way up at the ship's tip. The tanks remained at this fill level for about 2 hours, during which the ship periodically vented and managed its internal pressure. This was most likely a high-pressure qualification test designed to confirm that all vent systems can handle flight-level pressures, or possibly even exceed them. After about 4 hours in total, the ship was detanked and returned to an empty state. After a day of intense testing on Wednesday, it was time for the vehicle to head back to the production site, and so it did. Ship 38 made the roll all the way down Highway 4 and entered Mega Bay 2, where it will be prepped for its own engine testing campaign, likely about a month from now, based on past timelines. Although, when it was lifted inside Mega Bay 2, it was lifted into an orientation with the heat shield toward the back of the Mega Bay. So if you're looking into Mega Bay 2, you see the shiny side. Why does that matter? Well, they can't install engines on Ship 38 in that orientation. Later in the week, we did get a better idea of why so much attention has been given to Ship 38's door recently. The Starlink loader box that had been sitting inside the Star Factory for ages now was moved into Mega Bay 2 and presumably used for some kind of testing with Ship 38, explaining why it was lifted onto the center stand in an orientation that prevents engine installation. What exactly they were doing we can't say, because shortly after the box was moved to Mega Bay 2, the door was closed. Open the door, you cowards! They're not cowards, I'm just kidding. Of course, this schedule will now depend on how soon the current stack flies. Once Flight 10 is complete, SpaceX will need to reconfigure the orbital launch mount for ship testing once again, a process that would likely take a week or so at the absolute most. All right, now let's talk about Block 3, the next major step in Starship development, currently undergoing assembly in Star Factory in Mega Bay 1. The one thing we haven't seen yet is the start of stacking for the first Block 3 ship itself. Booster 18, the first Block 3 booster, is already nearly half stacked in Mega Bay 1, but Ship 39 is still just individual sections sitting inside a Star Factory that are just waiting to be stacked together. Meanwhile, over at Massey's, Booster 18.1, the test tank used to verify various Block 3 design elements such as the thrust structure and landing tank, remains strapped into the black structural test cage. Of course, there may have been some delays caused by the recent explosion of Ship 36, as well as the shifting priorities of repairing the infrastructure at the Massey outpost and completing Ship 38's test campaign. But now that Ship 38 has finished testing, it's very likely that focus will again shift towards this small test tank to help pave the way for Booster Block 3. One good sign here is that workers were spotted next to the test tank on Monday, which might be an indicator that they're gearing up for testing again. There's also some news on the ship front. Here we go, we're finally seeing visible progress on the Ship 39 nose cone, which has seemingly been sitting in a bit of a holding pattern for quite some time now. First, you'll notice it's finally sporting its 2 forward flaps. This marks the very first time we've seen flaps attached to Block 3 vehicle hardware. To be fair, the design changes here probably aren't huge, but it's still great to see work advancing. In addition, the ablative material sheets are finally being placed on this nose cone. These are one of the key components SpaceX puts in place before attaching the actual heat shield tiles, so this almost certainly means tile installation on Ship 39's nose is right around the corner. Checking in on the other nose cones, it looks like Ship 40 has now received every single pin for its thermal protection system tiles. It's likely undergoing other minor outfitting work while it waits for Ship 39's workstation to free up, at which point it can move on to flap installation and tile work itself. Behind those, we can see the nose cones for Ships 41, 42, and 43. That means there are at least 5, probably more, Block 3 Starships already in the production chain, all visible as they move through the nose cone fabrication process. I wish we had a more solid update for you on Booster 18, but since the transfer tube moved into Mega Bay 1, it's been pretty quiet around that first Block 3 booster. At least as far as we can see. SpaceX is likely focused on installing critical components inside the booster before the tanks are sealed up and access is no longer possible or easy. SpaceX may also be waiting for more data from the Booster 18.1 testing before finishing the stacking of the Booster 18 LOX tank. That's probably why visible progress, from the outside anyway, has slowed down. Of course, once we hear or see anything new, we'll be sure to report it here, since Booster 18 is essential for the first Block 3 Starship flight. SpaceX, of course, began rolling out Ship 37 just as we wrapped up last week's video, so we only got to show you a few quick views of rollout. Classic SpaceX timing. In fact, I bet they're gonna lift this thing like while I'm recording. Like there's a non-zero chance you get to watch Starbase Update and then this thing starts moving and then I turn around and go, oh no, I can't shoot photos of it. I'm busy shooting Starbase Update. But them's how it goes. Them's how it goes? Whatever. So, as you probably already know, early Monday morning, we saw the chopsticks rise into position. This was to get them ready for the lift, since the ship would naturally be hoisted using the chopsticks. After all, why bring in an external crane when you've got a perfectly good built-in one right there? SpaceX really didn't waste any time this week. It looks like their goal was to finish all testing on Ship 37 as quickly as possible, ideally wrapping up within days of it being rolled out. Later on, we'll get into why this fast-paced testing schedule is so critical for them. The rollout took place on Monday morning, with Ship 37 heading out fully equipped with 6 Raptor engines, 3 vacuum-optimized Raptors, and 3 sea-level Raptors. At that point in the week, the big question on everyone's mind was, what's the test flow going to look like? There were plenty of possibilities. Would they go for a standard sequence, a single-engine static fire followed by a full 6-engine static fire? Or maybe start with a careful tanking test? There was a lot of speculation, especially since this was something we've never seen before. And Starship being tested on the Orbital Launch Mount was just kind of wonky. One thing SpaceX had to take care of before installing Ship 37 on the launch mount was adding the Ship QD. Or, well, since it's not actually disconnecting for this test, we'll just call it the Ship umbilical. This plate allowed them to hook up the temporary ship fueling lines they'd set up on top of the booster quick disconnect hood. And there were quite a few lines to connect. Ryan Weber, one of our commentators and Starbase update writers, went ahead and labeled them for us. So let's take a closer look at what each of these umbilical lines actually do. You can of course spot the 2 main lines, the LOX line, that's the liquid oxygen supply, and the methane supply line, both running from the bottom of the quick disconnect. These are the primary lines used to fuel the vehicle. Next, we have the pre-press lines. Both a Starship and a Super Heavy booster need a certain operational pressure inside their tanks before they can ignite their engines. To achieve that, SpaceX uses these lines to pump gas into the tanks, bringing them up to the proper flight or test pressure. The final line is the methane reclaim line. If cycling or detanking is needed, SpaceX definitely doesn't want to simply vent methane into the atmosphere. Not only is that bad for the environment, but it's also extremely dangerous and against regulations. Instead, this line routes the methane back to the recondenser system within the tank farm. There, it's, you guessed it, condensed back into liquid form and stored again, ready to be reused rather than wasted. Sorry for the long explanation, but sometimes it's rather handy to understand all these technical and neat details of the ground support infrastructure. So it probably won't surprise you what happened next. SpaceX lifted Ship 37 onto the Orbital Launch Mount. What a wild sentence to say out loud. It's definitely fair to call this view a little surreal, even in a place that is, by nature, already pretty dang surreal. A Starship sitting on the launch mount without a booster beneath it just looks wrong, but also somehow right. And that's exactly what made this week of testing so fascinating to watch. If we're lucky, we might get one more chance to see something like this again when Ship 38 performs the rest of its pre-flight testing campaign. But that will likely be the final time we see a ship sitting directly on the launch mount like this. And with that, just 6 weeks after the massive explosion at the Massey Outpost, SpaceX pulled off something many thought would be impossible, or at least would take far longer. They had another ship fully prepped and ready for testing. Now, it's time to run through all the necessary pre-flight checkouts to help clear the path for Flight 10. One thing to point out here is that the Raptor vacuum engines still had their stiffener rings attached. This differs from the usual lifts we see on the Orbital Launch Mount when the ship is stacked on top of a booster. These rings provided much-needed extra stability to the more fragile vacuum nozzles, protecting them during firings in an environment outside the vacuum they're designed for. SpaceX will remove these stiffener rings before 37's final stacking for flight. Furthermore, during the final few meters of the lift, you can clearly see the 6 clamps designed to hold the ship down during the static fire test. These clamps are of the same design typically found between the ship and booster, and the very same type used on the other static fire stand as well. Just after the lift, I had a chance to capture this wonky scene with some really beautiful lighting, not unlike the lighting that is out right now. Also, I managed to get a remote shot of static fire, both of which are available on the shop as a print. As a reminder, when you get a print from the shop, the photographer who shot it gets a portion of the sale. So if you feel like supporting us in that way, it's a great way to support NSF, myself, and get something cool in return. Also, if you don't like any of my shots, Crew 11 also happened this week, and the Florida team was firing on all cylinders. So head on over to shop.nasaspaceflight.com, check out the prints. There's metal ones that you don't have to frame. It's great. They're printed directly on metal, and there's also paper ones in case you don't want to break the bank. Anyway, I figured I'd mention it. We really appreciate it. Let's move on. In the late hours of Tuesday, SpaceX shifted focus to some ground service equipment and tank farm testing around the Pad 1 area. This made perfect sense, especially since they had scheduled testing-related closures for the next 2 days, Wednesday and Thursday, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. for non-flight activities. It was clear It was time for Ship 37 to roar into life. Wednesday morning began with the chopsticks opening up and then moving into their usual launch position. Of course, this wasn't a launch, but SpaceX typically positions them as far away from the test area as possible, because when it comes to Raptor engines, the farther away you can move nearby hardware, the better. It's simply a smart safety measure to protect that equipment. And sure enough, SpaceX eventually moved into testing. The tank farm spooled up, and we saw both the liquid oxygen and liquid methane systems coming to life. A clear sign that engine testing was on the schedule. After a while, both the liquid oxygen and methane tanks developed a frosty layer, but then, well, nothing happened. It appears SpaceX ran into some sort of delay or technical issue, which is understandable how carefully they're treating this test. Soon after, we saw the familiar signs of an imminent abort, with detanking indicators starting to appear. At that point, it became clear that SpaceX was standing down from their first attempt to static fire Ship 37. Better luck the next time. On Thursday, it was the same deal. The road was closed, the tank farm started, and this time, it went. The W system activated, and we saw a successful firing of a single Raptor engine. Pretty nifty, even though the water nearly completely drowned out the rocket plume. We know this was a successful static fire because SpaceX was kind enough to confirm it on X, posting, quote, "Starship single-engine static fire demonstrating an in-space burn complete on Pad 1 at Starbase," end quote. Alongside the post, they shared some incredible imagery, including a camera shot tucked behind one of the ship's legs and a short video from an onboard camera in the ship's engine bay, looking down, showing the single sea-level Raptor firing. The reason SpaceX tests these in-space burns separately from the 6-engine static fire tests is that the process is quite different from a standard 6-engine static fire. In this case, the engine is started using propellant from the ship's header tanks, which are used in space to prevent issues with fuel sloshing inside the much larger main tanks. So the focus here isn't so much about testing the engine itself necessarily, it's also about validating the process and components that make this particular kind of burn possible. Shortly after the road reopened, SpaceX then opted for some additional inspections ahead of the 6-engine static fire. The dance floor moved back to the pad to be raised up underneath the launch mount, so it could be used to identify any potential issues before the expected much higher energy 6-engine test. The dance floor was removed Friday morning, which is definitely a good thing because it would be rather difficult and more than a little dangerous to fire engines with a work platform sitting right underneath the ship. Before major tests like this, SpaceX also runs a variety of subsystems through their paces. One example is the Launch Mount Detonation Suppression System, which you can see here being tested ahead of the big static fire test. This system's job is to clear out any pockets or bubbles of methane underneath the launch mount before the Raptor engines ignite, an important safety step to reduce the risk of any unintended detonation, which is something that once occurred during testing of Booster 7 that I'm sure we're all familiar with by now. Play the video, Ryan. But it's not just ground systems being tested. Ship side systems are also put through their paces. Take the flaps, for example. During propellant loading, you can see Ship 37's flaps moving and adjusting just as they would before an actual flight, as part of the final pre-flight checkouts. In a way, it's kind of like a mini wet dress rehearsal for the ship itself. After a brief pause by the Red Team, which caused some delays when they had to head to the pad, SpaceX found itself already halfway through their scheduled road closure. So they did something we rarely see, though it has happened before. They extended the closure further into Friday evening to make sure they had enough time to complete the static fire before the weekend. Of course, hindsight is 20/20, and it turned out they didn't even need the extra time, as the test was completed well within the original schedule. So, the test itself. Based on our observations, SpaceX held briefly at T-minus 40 seconds to run some final checks. Then, at last, we saw it. A full 10-second, 6-engine static fire of the ship on the Orbital Launch Mount. As you can see, the 6 engines weren't near enough to overwhelm the full force of the deluge system, which makes sense, considering that the system is designed to handle roughly 5 times that thrust. We also saw the usual ignition sequence, the first 3 engines lighting up, followed by the other 3. In that sense, this was a remarkably similar test to the static fires we often saw at Massey's, aside from the longer burn duration. Of course, they can't run extremely long static fire tests, 30 seconds or more, on the Orbital Launch Mount, since the deluge system is unable to operate for that long. So it's likely they chose a duration that would give them exactly the data they needed without pushing the system's limits. SpaceX described this test as a, quote, full duration static fire for the Starship preparing for our 10th flight test, end quote. In this case, full duration means the planned duration of the static fire, not the duration of the entire flight profile, which of course would last several minutes. Now let's talk about the timeline going forward. Elon Musk said on X, quote, tracking to launch Starship mid-August, end quote. I already hear some folks shouting, Elon time, and laughing at that, but honestly, this timeline seems fairly realistic. What SpaceX needs to do next is remove the ship from the Orbital Launch Mount, which we're pretty much waiting to happen any second now. In fact, it could happen by the time I'm done recording this video. Then SpaceX will roll it back to Mega Bay 2 and finish any remaining heat shield work along with work on other components of the ship. That part can easily be done in a couple of weeks and shouldn't hold up the schedule. The booster is also ready, just waiting for the ship and ground systems to catch up. The biggest factor shaping this timeline is clearing out all the makeshift pipes and the ship adapter from the launch mount. Right now, they can't even move or use the booster quick disconnect hood door because of all of this equipment sitting in the way. Once everything is removed, it's just a matter of stacking the booster on the Orbital Launch Mount, putting Ship 37 on top, and then it's go time. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing regulatory paperwork start to show up this week or early next week, setting a stage for a flight sometime around August 15th. Over the coming days, we'll, of course, do our best to keep you informed, both here on YouTube and across our social media, if there are any signs that a flight is imminent. We're definitely getting close, and huge props to SpaceX for moving so quickly after the setback they faced at the Massey Outpost. It's been truly impressive to watch. Now, we want to hear from you. When do you think Flight 10 will lift off? Give us a date, and do you believe we'll see Ship 38 take flight in September? Thanks for watching, and as always, be excellent to each other.